You cannot stand here like this. Come with me. Stay with you?
But everyone shunned me.
London in January of that year was a city of closed doors. The cold had descended from the north during the first week and hadn't lifted since, leaving frost along the river, smoke hanging low above the streets, and every respectable house glowing warmly behind. Windows that seemed to belong to another world. Behind those doors, fires burned, lamps shone, and people who had never wondered where they would sleep spoke comfortably over tea. For Henrietta Wendwood, however, the doors remained closed. She was 24 years old, and until 2 years earlier, she had been the daughter of a gentleman from Hertfordshire. Now she was simply the daughter of a disgraced man, carrying a surname that changed every face the moment it was spoken. At the final house on her list, Henrietta stood on the cold stone steps while the housekeeper read her letter of application. The woman had seemed almost kind at first, for the letter was well written and the hand unmistakably that of a lady. Then she reached the name Wendwood. The warmth vanished. Henrietta kept her back straight, because she had learned during the past 2 years that dignity was sometimes the only possession no one could take unless she surrendered it herself. "We have filled the position," the housekeeper said, folding the letter and returning it through the narrow space between the door and its frame. "You advertised this morning. It has been filled since." The door had already begun to close when the woman paused and looked at her with something between pity and warning. "I would not trouble the other houses, Miss Wendwood. Word travels. There is no respectable position in London for that name." Then the heavy door shut, leaving Henrietta alone beneath the polished brass knocker. She had known the truth for days, yet had refused to accept it completely until that moment. Every registry office had turned cold after hearing her surname, and every household that had first admired her references found some convenient reason to refuse her. Some had been polite, others openly contemptuous, but the cause never changed. Her father had spent 20 years keeping the accounts of a great charitable trust without a single accusation against him. Then a large sum disappeared, and documents written in a hand almost identical to his were presented before the court. 3 men swore they were genuine. No one important stood beside him when he insisted that he had never taken a farthing. That was not his. The newspapers destroyed him before the court finished its work, and he died within the year. Not of any illness the physicians could name, but of the shame that had entered every room before him and remained after he left. Henrietta believed him innocent. She had always believed. A daughter's belief, however, was not evidence. By the end of the fortnight, her money was nearly gone. She had sold her mother's brooch during the second week and now ate only once each day, stretching each meal as carefully as she stretched the coins remaining in her purse. Hunger had become quieter than she expected. It did not. It simply made the cold sharper, the streets longer, and every decision more difficult. She stood in the square holding the small case that contained everything she owned and considered leaving London for some manufacturing town where the name Wendwood might mean nothing. That was when the carriage stopped beside her. A footman in plain dark livery descended and approached with perfect formality. "Miss Henrietta Wendwood." She nodded, unable to imagine who could possibly be seeking her. He presented a sealed letter addressed in a spare, upright hand she did not recognize. Inside were only 3 lines. "You are offered the position of companion to my aunt, Lady Perseus, at Old Croft in Kent. The wages are £40 a year. The carriage will take you immediately." There was no signature, only a single letter written beneath the message. Henrietta read it twice before looking at the waiting footman. "Whose carriage is this?" "His Grace's, miss." "His Grace of what?" "Linwood." The name sent a colder feeling through her than the winter air. Everyone in London had heard of the Duke of Linwood, though few could claim to know him. Society called him the Duke who never spoke. Some said he was mad, others that he had committed some terrible act in his youth, while the most offended members of society insisted that he was simply too proud to waste words on ordinary people. What no one disputed was that he had not been heard to speak more than a few words together in public for many years. Henrietta looked again at the letter. Why would he offer me anything? The footman gave no answer because it was not his place to have one. The light was fading, the horses stamped against the frozen street. And Henrietta understood that there are moments when a choice is only another name. for the single path still open. She entered the carriage. 2 days later, Old Croft appeared beneath the winter dusk, not as the grim and silent house she had expected, but as a long, low building of grey Kentish stone with warm light shining from many windows. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the entire house looked not merely occupied but loved. Mrs. Ashby, the housekeeper, welcomed her with a kindness so immediate that Henrietta scarcely knew how to receive it. Her room had been prepared with a fire already burning strongly in the grate, the curtains drawn, and warm blankets folded across the bed. "Was I expected so precisely?" Henrietta asked. "His Grace came down himself this morning to make certain the chimney drew properly," Mrs. Ashby replied. "He does not often visit the guest rooms, but he wished this one ready." A duke had personally inspected a fire for a woman he had never met. Henrietta stood before the flames, holding out her frozen hands and wondering what price might eventually be demanded for such unexpected kindness. She met Lady Perseus that evening, an upright woman nearing 80 whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose conversation seemed determined to compensate for every word her nephew withheld. The old woman spoke continuously through tea, giving Henrietta time to settle before addressing the question both of them knew was waiting. "You are wondering why you are here," Henrietta admitted that she was. "My nephew proposed your name," Lady Perseus said. "That is all I know, and likely all he intends to explain." "You knew my name before I came?" "I did." "Then you know what people say of it?" Lady Perseus studied her quietly. "I know what people say. That does not mean I believe them." The following morning, unable to sleep, Henrietta went down early in search of the library. The room was larger than she had imagined, filled with shelves rising toward a high gallery and more books than she had seen since her father's collection was sold to satisfy debts he had never owed. For the first time in 2 years, something inside her began to ease. Then she turned and found the Duke of Linwood standing silently in the doorway. He was tall and dark, with grey beginning at his temples and a stillness that made his presence more commanding than speech might have done. His clear grey eyes rested on her with such complete attention that she felt he had already seen the mended gown, the worn shoes, the straight back, and every difficult year she had tried to conceal. She curtsied. "Your Grace." He inclined his head but did not answer. Instead, he crossed to a table, wrote briefly on a card, and left it behind before departing the room. Henrietta waited until he was gone, then picked it up. "The library is yours whenever you wish it. Take any book you like. No one will disturb you here at this hour but me, and I will not." She read the message twice. After 2 years of suspicion, humiliation, and doors closing before her, the silent Duke had offered her a place without demanding an explanation, gratitude, or price. Yet the look in his eyes troubled her more than any cruelty might have done. He had not looked at her with pity. He had looked at her as though he had been waiting for her arrival for many years, and as though the debt between them belonged not to Henrietta, but entirely to him. Henrietta quickly discovered that life at Old Croft followed a rhythm unlike any great house she had ever known. The estate was neither grand in the ostentatious fashion of London's fashionable mansions nor burdened by the rigid ceremony that governed so many noble households. Instead, everything seemed to move with quiet purpose, as though each person understood exactly where they belonged and took pride in fulfilling that place. Lady Perseus was, as promised, lively enough for 2 people. She filled every breakfast with stories of neighboring families, long-forgotten scandals, and amusing observations that often left Henrietta smiling before she realized it. Yet whenever the conversation drifted toward her nephew, the old lady became surprisingly restrained. "He has always preferred actions to explanations," she would say with a small smile. "You'll learn more by watching him than by asking questions." Henrietta soon realized how true those words were. The Duke was rarely seen during meals for more than a few minutes. He greeted his aunt with a courteous nod and acknowledged Henrietta with the slightest inclination of his head. Then he returned to the business of managing the estate before most gentlemen would have finished their morning tea. He never spoke. Not once. Instead, small ivory cards and a fountain pen accompanied him everywhere. When a servant required instructions, he wrote them. When estate accounts needed approval, he wrote a single sentence beneath the figures. When Lady Perseus teased him into joining her for tea, He answered with a brief note that usually made her laugh before she read it aloud. At first, Henrietta found the silence unsettling. Then gradually, she began to notice something else. Despite speaking almost no words, the Duke seemed to know every detail of life at Old Croft. He remembered the birthday of a stable boy's daughter. He noticed when one of the maids limped slightly after twisting her ankle. He quietly arranged for the blacksmith's widow to receive coal before winter storms arrived. Yet made certain the delivery appeared anonymous. None of these acts were ever announced. Most people never knew they had come from him. One rainy afternoon, Henrietta happened to witness another. She had been returning from the village with Mrs. Ashby when an elderly tenant farmer arrived at the front entrance, his hat clutched nervously between rough hands. The man's barn had partially collapsed during the previous night's storm. Before he could finish explaining, the Duke simply listened, wrote several lines on one of his cards, folded it, and handed it to the estate steward. Within an hour, carpenters were already loading timber onto wagons bound for the farm. The farmer attempted to thank his grace. The Duke merely shook his head and walked away. Before gratitude could become uncomfortable. Watching from the entrance hall, Henrietta found herself wondering how a man whom society described as cold could possess such quiet generosity. The contradiction refused to leave her thoughts. Their own conversations remained unusual. Every few days, Henrietta discovered a neatly written card left beside a book she had been reading or on the small writing desk in the library. The second volume has recently been restored. I thought you might enjoy it. Or the conservatory is warmer during the afternoon if you wish to read there. She began answering in the same manner. At first, her replies were little more than polite expressions of thanks. Then they slowly became longer. She commented on books, asked about the estate gardens, recommended a poem she thought Lady Perseus would enjoy. The Duke always replied, never with more words than necessary, never with fewer than kindness required. Without realizing it, they had begun holding conversations that neither of them spoke aloud. One crisp autumn morning, Lady Perseus invited Henrietta to walk through the western gardens. The old lady leaned comfortably upon her cane as they followed winding paths bordered by late roses and neatly clipped hedges. My nephew wasn't always like this, she said unexpectedly. Henrietta glanced toward her. You mean silent? Lady Perseus nodded. When he was younger, he laughed rather too loudly for polite society. Henrietta smiled. I find that difficult to imagine. So do most people. The old lady stopped beneath an ancient oak tree whose leaves had already begun turning gold. There was a time when every room seemed brighter after he entered it. She paused, looking toward the distant fields. Then something happened. Henrietta waited quietly. I've promised never to tell the story before he chooses to tell it himself. She sighed. But I can tell you this. My nephew has spent the last 10 years believing that silence causes less harm than words. Those few sentences lingered with Henrietta long after their walk ended. The sadness that occasionally crossed the Duke's face when he believed no one was watching. A man did not choose such a life without reason. Several days later, Henrietta entered the library earlier than usual. She found the Duke already there, seated beside the tall windows with several estate ledgers spread across the. He looked tired. For the first time since arriving at Old Croft, she noticed faint shadows beneath his eyes. As though he had slept very little. When he realized she had entered, he immediately gathered the papers into neat piles and slid a single card. I'm afraid I've occupied your favorite corner. Henrietta smiled despite herself. She picked up his pen. For the first time, she wrote before he did. Libraries are large enough to be shared, the Duke read the sentence. Then very slowly, he smiled. It was only the slightest change in expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But it transformed his entire face. For a brief moment, the solemn Duke of Linwood looked years younger. Henrietta returned to her book, pretending not to notice. Yet throughout the remainder of the morning, she found herself rereading the same page again and again. Not because the words were difficult, but because she could not stop thinking about that smile. For reasons she could not yet explain, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It had begun to feel safe. And without realizing it, Henrietta had started looking forward to the quiet hours they spent together in the library far more than she cared to admit. As the weeks passed, Henrietta settled into the quiet rhythm of Old Croft so naturally that she sometimes caught herself forgetting how uncertain her future had seemed only a month before. The house no longer felt unfamiliar, and neither did its master. Although the Duke still spoke only through the small ivory cards he carried in his pocket, she had learned to understand the subtle language of his expressions, the slight lift of an eyebrow when Lady Perseus exaggerated a story, the almost invisible smile that appeared whenever one of the younger servants succeeded at a difficult task, and the unmistakable concern that crossed his face whenever someone else was in pain. The silence that had once seemed intimidating had gradually become comforting. Yet Henrietta could not escape the feeling that something remained hidden beneath it. One afternoon, while helping Lady Perseus organize several old cabinets in the West Wing, she came across a leather box tucked behind a stack of faded account books. The lid had not been opened in years and a fine layer of dust covered the brass clasp. Inside were neatly tied bundles of letters. Lady Perseus looked at them for a long moment, before quietly closing the lid again. "They belong to my nephew," she said. "Some memories are best left untouched." Henrietta immediately apologized for opening the box, but the old lady merely smiled and motioned for her to sit. "There is something I think you should know," she said after a thoughtful silence. "Not because it will answer every question you have, but because I believe you've earned at least part of the truth." Henrietta listened without interrupting. 10 years ago, before my nephew inherited the dukedom, he was known as one of the brightest young men in Parliament. He loved debates, hosted dinners, argued about politics with anyone willing to challenge him, and could charm an entire room before the evening was over. She smiled faintly at the memory. "It is difficult to imagine now." "It is," Lady Perseus agreed, "which is precisely why so few people remember him that way." Her expression slowly grew more serious. "Then your father's trial began." Henrietta froze. "My father?" Lady Perseus nodded. "My nephew believed your father was innocent from the beginning." Henrietta stared at her, unable to speak. "He spent months trying to prove it. He interviewed witnesses, examined financial records, and even hired investigators. At his own expense. Why? Because he believed an innocent man was about to be sacrificed." The words settled heavily between them. Henrietta felt her heartbeat quicken. "He failed." Lady Perseus lowered her eyes. "Yes. The forged documents were accepted by the court before he uncovered enough evidence to challenge them." She paused. "Your father died believing no one had stood beside him." Henrietta could no longer feel her hands. She had spent 2 years believing that every influential man in England had remained silent, while her father was destroyed. Now she was learning that one man had tried. One man had simply arrived too late. And afterward, she asked quietly. Lady Perseus sighed. "My nephew blamed himself. He believed that if he had worked harder, moved faster, spoken more forcefully, your father might have lived." "Henrietta." She stopped. I closed her eyes. Suddenly, everything she had observed during the past weeks began fitting together. The unexpected invitation, the extraordinary kindness, the library, the careful attention, the strange look in his eyes the day they first met. It had never been pity. It had been guilt. That evening, Henrietta wandered through the gardens long after sunset. The autumn air had grown colder and a pale mist drifted across the lawns as lanterns flickered beneath the old trees. She found the Duke standing alone near the lake. He seemed unaware of her presence, his attention fixed on the still water before him. For several moments neither of them moved. Then he sensed someone behind him and turned. Their eyes met. Henrietta wanted to ask him whether Lady Perseus had spoken the truth. She wanted to tell him that he had no reason to carry another man's tragedy alone. Instead, she remained silent. The Duke reached into his coat and removed one of his familiar ivory cards. His pen hesitated above the paper. For the first time since she had known him, he appeared unable to find the right words. At last, he wrote only a single sentence. "I hope you are happy here." Henrietta looked at the card, then back at him. There were countless questions she could have asked. Instead, she simply nodded. "So am I." It was the first time she had answered him aloud. The Duke looked almost startled. Then, very gently, he smiled. The fragile peace at Old Croft lasted only a few more days. Late one afternoon, an elegant carriage arrived unexpectedly from London. Its passenger was Lady Vivian Ashcombe, one of the most influential women in society and an old acquaintance of the Linwood family. Lady Perseus welcomed her politely. Henrietta noticed something colder behind the woman's gracious smile. Before dinner had ended, Lady Vivian's attention had already settled upon her. "So," she said pleasantly, "you are Miss Wendwood." Henrietta inclined her head. "I've heard your father mentioned many times." The dining room fell unusually quiet. Lady Perseus changed the subject at once. But the damage had already been done. Lady Vivian smiled as though she had merely made ordinary conversation. Yet Henrietta understood exactly what she had intended. The following morning, whispers began spreading among neighboring families. Within days, invitations quietly disappeared. Visitors who had planned to call postponed their trips. Servants returning from the village carried uncomfortable rumors back with them. Some claimed the Duke had knowingly brought a criminal's daughter into his household. Others suggested that Lady Perseus had become too old to judge people's character. The cruelest rumor of all insisted that Henrietta had manipulated the silent Duke into protecting her. She pretended not to hear them. But every whispered conversation reminded her of London. Of closed doors, of her father's trial, of a name she could never escape. Late that evening, she stood alone in the library, staring at the shelves she had come to love. For the first time since arriving at Old Croft, she wondered whether leaving would be kinder than allowing the household to suffer. Because of her presence. She did not know that someone had already guessed exactly what she was thinking. And for the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Linwood was about to do something no one believed possible. Henrietta made her decision before dawn. She folded the few dresses she owned into the same worn suitcase that had accompanied her to London and then to Old Croft, carefully placing each book she had borrowed from the library back upon the shelves where she had first found it. She lingered over the final volume for several moments before returning it to its place, her fingertips resting lightly against the leather spine as though saying farewell to something far more precious than paper and ink. The library had become the one place where she had almost forgotten the weight of her surname. Now she feared that even this refuge had begun to carry too high a price. She had no doubt that the rumors would continue to spread. Lady Vivian possessed the rare talent of planting a single poisonous sentence and allowing society to cultivate the rest. Already neighboring families had begun questioning the Duke's judgment. And Henrietta could not bear the thought that the kindness he had shown her might become another weapon used against him. She left a short letter on Lady Perseus's writing desk, thanking the old lady for her generosity and apologizing for the trouble her presence had caused. There was no letter for the Duke. Some things could not be explained on paper. The carriage was waiting in the front courtyard just after sunrise. Mist still drifted across the lawns, and the servants moved quietly through the morning as though reluctant to disturb the unusual silence that had settled over the house. Henrietta had just stepped onto the stone drive when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Mrs. Ashby appeared first, breathless with concern. "Miss Wendwood, please wait." Before Henrietta could answer, another figure emerged from the entrance hall. The Duke. He crossed the courtyard without haste, yet there was an urgency in his eyes she had never seen before. One of his familiar ivory cards remained clutched in his hand, but he made no attempt to write upon it. Henrietta lowered her gaze. "Your Grace, I believe this is for the best." He shook his head. She continued before emotion could weaken her resolve. "The rumors will only grow worse. Your household has shown me nothing but kindness, and I cannot repay that kindness by becoming the cause of further scandal." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he let the small ivory card fall from his hand onto the gravel. For the first time in 10 years, he chose not to write. Instead, he spoke. No. The single word was quiet, almost fragile. Yet everyone in the courtyard froze as though the world itself had stopped turning. Mrs. Ashby covered her mouth. The coachman stared in disbelief. Henrietta simply looked at him, unable to breathe. The Duke swallowed, his voice rough from years of silence. "You are not leaving." Each word seemed to demand enormous effort, but once they had begun, they no longer wished to remain hidden. "I have been silent for far too long." That afternoon, the Duke ordered invitations sent to every influential family within the county. By evening, the great drawing room of Old Croft was filled with landowners, magistrates, clergymen, and neighbors who had spent the previous week repeating Lady Vivian's whispers with Complete confidence. Lady Vivian herself arrived wearing the satisfied smile of a woman expecting to witness another quiet humiliation. Instead, she found the Duke standing before the assembled guests. No ivory cards rested in his hand. No pen. Only several worn documents tied carefully together with faded ribbon. The room gradually fell silent. Many expected him to write. Instead, he spoke. His voice was deep and uneven from long disuse, yet every word carried through the hall with unmistakable clarity. 10 years ago, an innocent man was condemned. A murmur passed through the guests. The Duke continued. I believed I could prove his innocence. I failed. He held up the bundle of papers. These documents were discovered several months after the trial. They prove that the financial records presented against Mr. Wendwood were forged. Arthur Pembroke, the family solicitor, stepped forward and confirmed the authenticity of every document before the assembled witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming: the forged signatures, the altered ledgers, the testimony that had never reached the court. One by one, the foundations of a decade-old lie collapsed. Lady Vivian's confident expression disappeared. She attempted to protest, insisting that reopening such an old scandal served no purpose. The Duke looked directly at her. For 10 years. An innocent man's name has remained stained. His voice strengthened with every sentence. That purpose is sufficient. No one answered. No one could. When the guests had finally departed, evening settled quietly over Old Croft. Henrietta stood alone in the library where their strange friendship had first begun, looking out across the gardens now softened by the fading light. She heard footsteps behind her. This time she did not turn. She knew who it was. The Duke approached slowly, stopping beside the very table where he had once left his first handwritten note. I should have spoken years ago, he said quietly. I believed silence was easier than failure. He paused. But silence protected no one. Henrietta looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes. You tried to save my father. I tried. You were too late. I know. She stepped closer. My father died believing no one believed him. The Duke lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. Henrietta gently shook her head. You cannot change what happened. A long silence followed. Not the silence of distance. The silence of two people finally standing on the same side of the truth. The Duke reached into his pocket and removed a small. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a simple diamond ring. I invited you to Old Croft because I believed I owed your family a debt that could never be repaid. He looked into her eyes. I was wrong. The debt was never what brought me to this moment. He drew a careful breath. I love you, Henrietta. I believe. I have loved you from the day I watched you walk into this house carrying nothing but courage. He smiled faintly. I would rather spend the rest of my life earning your trust than asking your forgiveness. For several seconds, Henrietta said nothing. Then she reached out and closed his trembling hand around the ring. You've already begun. A smile brighter than any she had shown since arriving at Old Croft slowly appeared. And if you'll still have me, I would very much like to spend the rest of my life helping you fill this house with words again. The Duke laughed softly. It was a quiet sound. An unfamiliar sound. But it was real. Outside the library windows, the first light of spring touched the gardens beyond, promising new life after a long winter. 4 years, both of them had believed that the past would forever define their future. Instead, they discovered something far gentler. A damaged reputation could be restored. A silent heart could learn to speak again.